Hi, everyone. This is Jacqueline for the Homeschool Hangout, and I am joined by Sugar Jones.
Hello.
Say hi, Sugar.
Hello.
Today we are talking about election education and how to handle the educating our kids about all the crazy elections that are going on. I know, at least here in California, we are having a primary election in June, but also a state election that covers some specific things. So, Sugar, what do you think about when you think about elections and kids?
Well, my kids have always we always have the news on. We're always talking about politics in our house. And so they've always been very aware of it. And, I've heard people talk about, not wanting to influence their children too much, but you're going to, no matter what. You're going to just with, what you talk about all the time. So what I try and do is, even though we have specific opinions about certain things, I try and give the kids the arguments against my opinion so that they can at least understand how I came to that opinion. So when we talk about politics in our house, we really come at it in a way of just having a logical reason for our decisions and our opinions, not necessarily just going with a party. So that's kind of how we go.
Same thing here. For us, of course, we really pull from history and logic. And my kids, I don't do a lot of both sides completely. I do what the other side says and why we make the decisions we do. I feel that kids naturally inherently rebel against their parents, so I'm not too worried about biasing them for the rest of their lives. Of course, they're going to question me. That's their job. So to me, it's very important to explain how elections work and why elections work the way they do. And I'm putting together a post for Nerd Family on election resources. So I thought we could just talk about a few here real quick.
Very cool.
Yeah, Scholastic has a whole lot of printables, as does ABC. I'm reading off my other screen. ABC Teach, that actually talk about elections, why we have elections, and they even have stuff about like how to make a voting booth. So if you wanted to have a little election in your house about, let's say, let's not make it bedtime because that's not an election issue in my household. But what TV show we're going to watch as a family Saturday night? You could do some sample stuff like that. And what I really like about ABC Teach is they even have charts to compare candidates. And meaning they're not specific to a candidate, but they help the kids fill in the charts about, what the differences are, what they agree on, what they're opposite on. So I think that's kind of cool.
I really, that's a great way to kind of have that same conversation, right? Wanting to see both sides of everything, because you don't want kids to just think that, like what you just said, that your kids will naturally rebel against you at some point in their lives. I think with my older children, I might not have spent as much time with them going with both sides, talking about both sides, but I still have those conversations now. And we do, those are conversations that now that you're practicing that, the way you're setting that up right now, that can lead into having healthy conversations, with your kids as adults as well. You're really setting the groundwork for how you have conversations about everything, which is really kind of cool.
It is. And in our household, we really try to enforce the fact that politics isn't personal. And when I say that, I mean, I've had kids come to me because I live in a very conservative area of California where they come to me and say, oh, is Barack Obama bad because X, Y, or Z? And they're these personal statements. And that angers me so much because while I'm very honest, I'm going to out myself as a conservative. I am a libertarian by most of my political leanings with a very personally conservative life. I did not vote for Barack Obama. I'm fine with that. But it isn't because I didn't like his attitude or because I didn't like how he wears his clothes. It was all politically driven and position driven.
It's funny that you say that, because my mom actually she'll make those statements, and I think that's what has really made me want to do the opposite. She'll just talk about, what clothes they wear and, and the gossip and this and that. And it doesn't matter who's in office. She just loves to have that, that salacious kind of Kardashian conversation. And I'm like, this isn't TMZ. This is actually important stuff. This isn't about, what spring wardrobe and what's appropriate for, you know, showing up for this or that or whatever. And I really dislike when people fall into that, because it loses the strength of your argument. And that's another thing that I kind of try and teach the kids is, as much as people have those salacious little conversations, that is what detracts from actual, you know, stuff being taken care of in our country. So.
Oh, definitely. I think when we're more concerned with whether or not a candidate wears the right suit, and let's be very honest, with women, it's 10 times worse. And when I say women, I don't just mean women voters. I mean women candidates.
Right.
These women, how poofy is your hair? How dark is your lipstick? Ooh, too much mascara. I mean, I remember watching Michelle Bachmann in a debate wearing false eyelashes, and it was obvious the woman had never worn false eyelashes before.
She was having a hard time when she was blinking, I know.
Oh my goodness, she's doing this thing, and I'm like, dude, that is totally distracting from anything of value you may or may not be saying. And so we've pushed it, though, to this, you know, I wasn't the cool kid in high school, and so maybe that's part of it is it's not about being the cool kid. It's about being well-spoken that's important. Exactly. And when I say well-spoken, I don't mean smooth. I mean, like, actually knowing what the hell you're talking about.
Right.
You know? So, which brings up another really interesting resource. We've talked about C-SPAN's classroom. It's c-spanclassroom.org. They actually have a really robust campaigns and elections section, down to the point that they talk about 2014 political ads, how much money was spent, and how effective they were. And I thought that was really interesting because they were talking about Larry Sabato talks about the fact that there's more than $2.6 billion estimated to be spent in political television ads in 2014. And he breaks down what kinds are effective and the styles that are effective and everything. And I think that's important for kids because we already talk about consumerism in our house of, yes, the reason they send you a free Lego magazine with commercials in them, ads, is to make you buy stuff. And I think having an aware consumer, even in voting, is very important.
Well, my son calls commercials propaganda for kids. He actually uses the word propaganda. So they very much understand that they're being pitched at all times, and they know that they're being pitched about stuff, and they know they're being pitched about ideas. So I think raising kids that are aware of that, you know, will hopefully create a more aware constituency in the future. I think it's our responsibility as parents to do so, whether you homeschool or not, to make sure that your kids grow up to be very aware, active citizens of your country and of your region. But, you know, it's funny, you're talking about the different sites, and some of the things that I'm seeing, I took a look at pbs.org, and they have a lot of really great lessons in here. Things like why vote, just understanding the whole reason behind voting. Something called Citizenship City, talking about what happens when you don't vote, you know, those sorts of things. So actually, you know, not raising little adults that are apathetic about the voting process, that think their vote doesn't count. Because once they start talking about electoral colleges and everything else, it starts to get really muddled. And they don't understand that showing up for Election Day affects their local cities, their local libraries, their state parks, how their roads and bridges are maintained. So letting them know that it's on a local level is very important as well. So I really like to always kind of bring that back down, just so that they're aware of those kind of things. And I really like that the PBS site has some really great stuff on that too. And they seem to have materials, you know, material requirements and procedures, and little extensions and adaptations for the lessons. And it's you know, pretty healthy little site here for it's pbskids.org/democracy. So there's another little tool for us to use.
I think that's great. I think it is teaching them how everything is affected by voting or not voting, and by the people you put in power. Because I think sometimes it's easy to say, well, we didn't vote on this one specific thing, but you point to how the elected officials that you put in did. And I think that's a big key.
Yep.
And so for me, another thing that I found, okay, so I don't know if every state gets this. I know, Sugar, you've seen these. This is the California Statewide Direct Primary Election Voter Information Guide. Due to budgetary restrictions, you get one per family. It doesn't matter how many people vote. So I found online where you can access the PDF versions. And this actually goes through each proposition and everything and does your for and against. It does every state candidate and what they say they believe. And like what their position does. So like on insurance commissioner, I'm looking at the insurance commissioner thing because so many people say, oh, that's a nothing position. You know,
oh no. In California, we understand that the insurance commissioner can really jack stuff up for you.
Exactly. And so I love in this, it actually goes into specifically insurance commissioner oversees and directs all functions of the Department of Insurance, licensed, regulates, and examines insurance companies, answers public questions and complaints regarding the insurance industry, and enforces California insurance laws and adopts regulations to implement the laws. And then
you know what that user guide might be really good for now that I'm thinking about it, because sometimes the kids will come and ask you a question like, Mom, how come, or who's in charge of, blah, 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 because they start looking around and seeing, you know, maybe they're riding past this pothole that your mom has to kind of go around all the time to get to school, you know, and somebody might say, or if you just frustrated in your car say, oh, I wish they would fix that. Well, rather than just saying they would fix that, taking that guide out and pulling out, well, who does take care of that? Who do we, and how does that, you know, how is that affected by me voting or not voting? So that's a great way to make everyday little situations real to the kid.
It does, and our Secretary of State here in California has a website, and they have a sub-website for this election, but I know the Secretary of State website in California, and even like here in Fresno, the government website for Fresno is very searchable. If you put in an issue, like at one point in time, I wanted to know what it was going to take to get a turn signal out here by us. I put that in our search box, and it popped up with the office and the phone number of the person responsible, whether or not it was elected or appointed, the whole bit. And I called them and said, what does it take? And they explained the process. So it's a really great thing to use these websites, to use these voter guides, because the other part is you paid for the voter guide to be developed. You might as well use it. And we also get one here for Fresno County. This is what it's our sample ballot, but in our sample ballot has all of the details down to our candidate statements along with all the ballot measures and everything that's local. So a lot of the education funding and specific road funding and all that can be locally done too. So reading it's good.
So now I know that you just said that you do your absentee voter. So you're there with kids and you're probably explaining to them how it is that you're voting and why and all that good stuff, which is really great. But have you guys ever taken the kids to the voting booth on election day?
You can do both. In California, if you have an absentee ballot and you haven't submitted it, you can go in and vote that day. And separately, my husband does not have an absentee. Mine originated from surgeries and babies and all that stuff because I was missing the June elections because I'd be on bed rest or throwing up or exhausted. But having 4 kids, they can kind of look at you a little funny when you say, can I take them in to vote with me? They kind of look at you, and you're like, seriously, dude? Yeah. But we have done that and taught them about that process. The other part is get to know your local poll workers, and they'll walk the kids through it for you.
Yeah. So that's what our actual, in our neighborhood, for the longest time, the neighborhood we lived in for many, many years, the voting booth was, or the polling place was actually at my kids' school, my older kids that, you know, the local school that they were going to before I started homeschooling my younger two. And so they were very aware of the process every year. They knew that it was election day and they understood, and the teachers, you know, took the time to do that. And so now with the little kids, what we do is we actually take them to the polling place so that they can have that same experience of seeing what goes on. And, you know, they don't get the little sticker that says I voted, but you know, their dad wears his sticker every day, you know, all the time. And so they get very excited, you know, that there's a sticker involved in the process as well. So even the littlest things get kids excited so that one day when they're 18, you know, they will take the time to do that. It's almost like you have to start feeding them, not necessarily just the information and teaching them, but just feeding them that desire to want to participate in the voting process.
Well, and that's where it's also nice, too, to locally be involved, because at our church, we have local officials. You know, I happen to be friends with the ex-Fresno County Superintendent of Schools' daughter. Our kids are really good friends, our little girls. So in our church, we talk about the fact, you know, you need to vote. We can't, you know, we're not going to tell you what to vote on, though it's very clear sometimes what they would like you to vote. But you get to meet these people, and they understand, my kids understand they get their jobs by people voting or not voting. So that's kind of cool. And your polling place doesn't give the kids stickers?
Well, we didn't get them last time.
Ours does, to the point that I have not mailed in my ballot, and so we have a drive-through service where we can drop off our ballot at our local polling place. And they asked me how many kids I had in the car and handed me stickers.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, so maybe this might have been a husband thing. He's not real big on like all the little cutesy things that moms do for kids. So.
Yes, so there is that. You know, it's just a personality difference. So we've talked about how generally to educate your kids on elections, and we've talked about how to educate them on a specific election. But then there's the other side. There is the issues, and everybody has their own viewpoint on the issues. And at least for me, I don't always want to have a 45-minute conversation trying to explain something to them. So I utilize things like YouTube, like you wouldn't believe. Now, this is where the disclosure, I am a libertarian, I am a conservative, you may or may not want to use the sources that I use. I'm saying that right now. I am a big fan of the Cato Institute and Learn Liberty and things like that. And so a good example, and I will include a link later, is the Cato Institute has the true cost of public education. We all homeschool. I think we can all agree that we don't necessarily agree with how public education is funded. Correct. It is a great example on consumerism and public education costs. And so this is a 3-minute video that really kind of highlights some of the big points and gives you great discussion jump off. Another one I love that is never something that is, you don't vote specifically on this, but it's very important, is the broken window fallacy. And there's a video I like on this. And it is something that drives the mentality of war and taxes and destruction. Are you familiar with the broken window fallacy, Sugar?
So we were talking about this earlier, and you said you were going to go ahead and explain that.
Okay. This is a theory, and we've all heard it. Oh, there's a war. Great. That means for the economy, we're going to increase production, make jobs, and it's wonderful, right?
Right.
The broken window philosophy was written by Frederick Bastiat, I believe is his name, in France a long time ago, but it's a theory of, so let's say you have a baker. He's got a business, right? He has windows in this business. A local hooligan comes and breaks one of his windows. And on one hand, you're like, oh, no, that's horrible. It's destruction. It's bad. It's bad, bad, bad. The other side is now he has to go pay a glazier or a window maker to put in a new window. So in theory, it's all good because it's creating jobs. Destruction is creating jobs. And that is, and I'm going to just say it, a more liberal viewpoint on that. But the conservatives tend to say, no, that's not the case because, granted, he spent $300 replacing that window and paying that window maker who then turns around and buys food with that. But otherwise, he might have spent that money on something else. He could have saved money, therefore preventing his family from going into debt. Or he could have gone and bought himself a brand new suit, therefore creating jobs in another field. And the broken window fallacy is the idea that because there is destruction forcing someone to pay money, it creates jobs. And the fallacy is it doesn't necessarily create jobs.
Right. Well, and I will caution and say that what we're talking about is fiscally conservative people, not necessarily conservatives, because there are a lot of conservatives that tend to be pro-war. So maybe we should probably tread lightly on the war conversation.
And it's not, well, it's
war. It's mostly about fiscal.
It's very much fiscal conservative because we're also talking about taxation creating jobs. We're talking about the idea of potholes being good because it gives street layers a job versus those people who work in repairing potholes might have gone on to create something new instead of just fix something that got broken.
Right.
And that's kind of the debate is the difference between should we be fixing broken things and that's a good thing for our economy? that we have broken things to fix, or we could have taken that capital and created something new. And that's where the real argument is the baker would have had the same $500. He may not have had to repair something, but could have gone on to hire a new employee, or could have gone on to build something new.
So where's that video located? And you said you found some other videos as well?
Yes. The Victory Report has a really great illustrated version of the broken window fallacy, and it's actually the Victory Report 1, and they only have a few videos, so it's easy to find. And also the Cato Institute has the true cost of public education, and it's literally Cato Institute Video is their YouTube channel. And you know, if you don't agree with the fiscally conservative side of it, because these are fiscally conservative, this is not speaking about morality, this is not speaking about lifestyles, this is just talking about, give me my money and I want my money back.
Right.
There are lots of sources out there. So find and vet sources that you agree with, and it's a great conversation starter for your kids.
Well, going back to the site that I was talking about, the pbskids.org democracy site, there is another aspect of voting that's kind of interesting. They have a whole section called Graphically Speaking, and this goes into math and social studies. And this is basically the graphing, you know, the data that's behind elections. The data in elections is actually really fascinating. Once you see what happened afterwards, you can see why the election turned out. Even though emotionally it may feel like it may seem like an election tide is going a certain way, the popular opinion is going a certain way. Once the graphics, once the data comes out and you analyze the data, you can see why it didn't turn out as everybody expected, particularly in the last presidential election. You could see why. And there was a lot of interesting data that came out after that one that had a lot to do with things that we use every day, you know, Facebook and Twitter and all that good stuff, and how one side employed it so much better than another side. And that might go back into what you were talking about earlier, too, on the cost of elections and the cost of advertising and all that good stuff. It's interesting to analyze all of that stuff, because in the future then, when you take a look at how things are going, you can kind of, I think data is a great way for us to not only understand what happened, but what is now happening, and then, you know, another way to logically analyze what's going on in your world.
I think so too, and you know, my husband always has this line, and it's an old line of price is information. Look at who makes the most money in elections, and it's people like, and I'm looking at Frank Luntz is somebody I've listened to for years. He's actually a pollster and a numbers analyzer. He, you know, he's done Fox News, he's done lots of them. James Carville, all of them that come out with strategies. Those strategies all have numbers behind them.
Yeah, and so this is actually a really cool lesson, though, you know, if you think about it, because you can really take a look at, you know, what the math is behind it. You know, they don't want to hear about data analysis. They want to hear, if you say it's math, it might be okay. But when you start to kind of compile the information together and actually make it real, you know, it's almost like that show Numbers, where they see numbers everywhere, you know. It's just seeing the formulas that are going on, or like even the Lego movie, where they were trying to figure out how to solve a problem, and as they're jumping through the air, they're thinking of the different parts that they're going to use. I always think of like layering data on what we see around us, you know, and so getting your kids to kind of understand the math behind what's going on is really neat. The summary behind this lesson plan is that students will explore the relationship between state population and federal and congressional representation, which is really cool. It goes back to what we were saying before about you didn't necessarily vote in a particular situation, but you voted for a person that did, and this is how it was affected, right? So it's using website data or almanacs and graph state population, state size, number of congressional representatives. This goes into a lot of what our politics, or, you know, our political system and structure is about. It's a great way to do math and to do history at the same time, and also really for a kid to grok, to really get what politics really comes down to, and it really is always about the numbers.
Well, that is where it's extremely interesting too, when you start looking at pre-election I don't know if you've ever participated in, but they say, can you rate these 4 things in order of importance? And it's like usually like security and education and welfare and a bunch of political issues.
Right.
And so the politicians will say, this is everyone's number one thing, but nobody votes that way. They ask you if it's important, but they don't ask you how important it is to compare it with other things. And so that's always really, really interesting, too, is to look at all that data analysis. And another thing for the C-SPAN stuff talks about is they also talk about changes in elections, in election law every year that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, they have Trevor Burrus is talking about the voting law changes and the impact on American citizens, including things like talking about ID versus registration versus absentees. That's all numerical analysis. Also, redistricting is a very interesting thing that comes up before Congress every year. Whether or not you agree with all the analysis, they do a lot of population studies and how all of our census data really affects how we're allowed to vote and where we're allowed to vote.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, that is interesting, you know, is like whenever we have new laws that come into effect, we have to, you know, we always have to give our kids the rules of the house so that they understand where their boundaries are, right? That's what we're constantly doing, just like our new laws that come out are our boundaries on how we are, you know, to behave as citizens within our city, state, country, everything. And so when new laws come out, it's a great way to explain the process of how laws are created. There's always that Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill. That's always the best way to start. I'm sorry, my favorite way to explain the whole situation. But then beyond that, like how it's voted and everything else, how they publicize everything, and then how that law affects you, you know, that kid or possibly the parent. And so, you know, just like anything like, you know, any kind of new changes to speed limits. Remember when speed limits were 55, but then they raised the speed limit to 65, and the information that was used to raise the speed limit to 65 in certain areas of the state, that sort of thing, and how, you know, how that is affected by children, you know, all the way down to the safety of vehicles now versus vehicles in the 60s and 70s. So that's kind of stuff that's really may seem a little too up here to some kids, but maybe kids that are, you know, junior high or high school that might start needing to know how these laws are going to affect them as somebody that's just driving to work, or even like driver's license laws for minors changed so drastically 10 years ago. That when you and I were younger, we could go out, we could drive at 16. When my older kids were of driving age, they, you know, there were a lot stricter laws, which is great. It reduced a lot of accidents, and there was information why there was a lot of, it's not fair, because my daughter was one of the first years that had to have certain laws and, you know, that restricted how she was going to be able to drive. And I was thankful because I was glad that she wasn't going to be in a car full of teenagers that just got their licenses that didn't know what they were doing. So for me, I just felt safer. And so understanding why, you know, the safety, the different research and information that goes into a law changing is important for us to explain to our kids of all ages, I think.
I think so too. And I know another couple things that have been interesting is when you vote for a law or a tax or something, it doesn't immediately take effect. And discussing the fact that...
Unless it's a retroactive Proposition 30.
Well, there's a lot of that. But traditionally, I mean, because we've talked about in January when the new laws kick in, and the questions come up with my children of, but we didn't just vote on that. Why is it coming in January 1st? It's discussing the fact that even though the public has voted on something, they have a certain amount of time to take it to court, to overturn it, to all these different things. That makes that stuff really interesting, especially here in California where we like to sue over laws a lot.
Right.
You know,
well,
and...
You know, another thing, when you said that right now, I just thought it got me thinking. The other process of the electing and being a citizen of your city, county, state, country is, you know, there were some things that were going on in the state of California a few years ago that I wasn't really thrilled about, and so I went out to a protest, and I brought my kids with me. And they were, you know, they were aware of what was going on. They understood what, they were very young, actually. It was a few years ago, so they might have been early grammar school years. But what am I going to do? Drop them off with a babysitter while I go do a protest? I took them with me, and they got to be kind of part of the scene, and they still remember it too. And I remember some people saying, "Oh, I don't think kids should be part of protests or anything like that. They should really grow up to have their own ideals and everything." But what my kids got to see is they got to see that. The ability of citizens to be able to speak up, and then they've also been able to see how that is responded to by countries around the world, how it's not necessarily something that's very welcome in other countries, and how them being able to voice their opinions in a public arena, such as a public protest, is really a special thing, and that they should take advantage of that if at all possible, if they're really that ticked off, if they really want to show their congressmen, their elected leaders, they're really not happy about what's going on and they're going to cause a stir until something is fixed, then that's also a part of the process that I think that they should be part of. I don't care how old they are or what age they are. I mean, when I was in junior high and high school, our school was going to be turned into something else, and we had a sit-in. And I mean, that was in the 80s. It wasn't like the 60s where they had sit-ins. And we had a sit-in, and it was in the newspaper, and it was very, very empowering for me as a teenager. And I really think that's something that younger kids should be open to experiencing as well.
I think we forget that on their 18th birthday, a switch is not flipped. They're not all of a sudden going to care. And I've been very blessed. I mean, my mom marched for the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and I had buttons for it. My mom was a little bit out. My mom grew up in the Bay Area.
Good for her.
Well, and then as a child for local elections, and my mom also swung the other way. So I've had both experiences in my life. She was always extremely conservative when my siblings were younger, but for me, I'm the older child. And I was out walking precincts.
Hey, there's nothing conservative about equal rights. Equal rights is a woman's thing. It's not conservative or liberal.
We'll get into a discussion about the ERA later and protected classes versus unprotected classes. But I mean, she was much more out there when I was little. But local elections, we would know a candidate who is running, and those little flyers that are on your doorsteps. My mom would bribe me with pizza and Circus Peanuts candy in second grade, and I'd walk the neighborhood and put them on the doorsteps, which meant I read them. Yeah, it's not a magical day when you're going to care. I love. Did you ever watch The West Wing?
Yeah, a few. I couldn't. I'm sorry, but I don't like watching obvious political statements on TV shows. So I tend to stay away from those kind of shows.
Oh, see, I think I've watched the entire series 3 times. But there is an episode where these kids show up and they've earned the right to go to the White House, and the thing they want to talk about is whether or not children should be allowed to vote. And they put forth this very mature argument talking about the effects of, it's like the idea of somebody who is 60 voting on changing elementary school education and changing the future of taxation and everything, when the kids are going to be the ones to put forth the money for it. And while I don't necessarily believe a 10-year-old should be able to vote, it was a very interesting thing because these children were respected not for their views, but the fact that they had them.
Right. It's a very compelling argument, and it's really cool that a kid had it. Although It was scripted by writers in a writing room.
Of course it was. But it was that idea, though, that I think kids don't realize they can have views, and they can write position papers. And if they blog, they can put those out. They can get them printed in the local paper, and they may sway voters. They may sway adult voters who are voting, and they have a right to those positions. They just don't have a right to vote yet.
Right. And so the whole premise of what we're saying today is basically start teaching your kids about the election process. Start teaching your kids about being a citizen of their city, county, state, country, and start explaining to them the importance of voting and how exciting it is and how important it is, and and turn it into a math, a social studies, a history, an English lesson. Do whatever lessons you need to do, but elections are important, and kids should be part of the process from the very beginning.
So true. And there are so many great free resources, either that are purely curriculum driven, like the PBS stuff and the C-SPAN stuff, or just free resources that are out there for all voters and citizens to read.
And like everything else, always make sure that those resources are credible.
Yes, definitely, definitely, definitely. Do a little bit of due diligence, but it's not like you've got to go out and buy whole new curriculums. So that's always nice too.
Yeah.
So we don't have any questions waiting for us, so I think that brings us to an end of this episode. Join us next week, and if you have anything you would like us to discuss, please let us know in the comments or on our Google Plus page, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye, guys.